I'm Eleanor Maddox, 50 years old, and I command the Combat Drone Enterprise for the United States Air Force. For 20 years, I gave my family loyalty and quiet pride while they called my career a video game with a paycheck and filed me under the office side. But when a young airman ordered me off the flight line at the very base I was about to command, not knowing who I was, I finally let the truth speak for itself instead of defending it. Have you ever been dismissed by the people who were supposed to know you best? If so, tell me your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I get into what happened, let me know where you're tuning in from. And if you've ever had to stand up for yourself after being underestimated, hit that like button and subscribe. The first thing I ever loved was the sound of a fighter coming home. I was 7 years old, standing in the backyard of base housing, when my father's squadron came over the field, low and loud, on their way to the pattern. The whole house shook. My mother set down her coffee, and I just stood there with my chin tipped up, feeling the noise go through my chest like a second heartbeat. My father landed an hour later and walked in still smelling like jet fuel, and to me he might as well have walked in off the surface of the sun. I followed him everywhere those years. I asked him 100 questions about the jet, about the missions, about what it felt like to push the throttle forward and feel the whole world fall away beneath you. He answered some of them in the clipped way of a man who didn't think of his work as a story, and every answer I kept like a coin in a jar. On weekends, he would take me out to the fence line at the edge of the base, and we would watch the squadron shoot approaches. And for those hours, I was his. Not his daughter, the way Grant would later be his son. The heir, the obvious one. But his in the way that the only person who loves a thing as much as you do is yours. I think that is why the later years cut so deep. I had not started out on the outside. I had started out right next to him at the fence, and I had been moved out, slowly, without ever being told why. In my father's house, you were measured by one thing: hours in a cockpit. Everything else was support staff. He never said it like a rule because he didn't have to, yet it was in the way he told stories at dinner, the way his voice changed when an old squadron friend called, the way he looked at the sky when a jet went over even decades after he stopped flying them. Colonel Raymond Maddox had flown fighters his entire adult life, and he believed all the way down that the person who made the decision was the pilot, and everyone else just handed him the wrench. I wanted it as badly as he did. Maybe more, because I had to want it from the outside. I memorized the silhouettes of every aircraft on the ramp before I was 10. I knew the difference between an afterburner climb and a clean one by sound alone. When my little brother Grant was still in diapers, I was already drawing instrument panels on the backs of my homework. I didn't want to be near the flying. I wanted to be the one flying. My mother, Sylvia, understood me better than my father did, but she had spent 30 years as a fighter pilot's wife, and she had learned to keep the peace by agreeing with whoever was loudest at the table. So when I said I was going to fly, she smiled and said, "We'll see, sweetheart," in the voice she used when she meant, "Don't get your hopes up." I got into the Air Force Academy in 1994, the year I turned 18. I want to be honest about what that took, because no one in my family ever fully understood it. I was not a legacy admit who coasted in on my father's name. I outworked everyone I knew. I ran in the dark before class. I tutored myself through calculus at a kitchen table while Grant watched cartoons. And when the acceptance letter came, my father read it, nodded once, and said, "Well, let's see if you can hack it." That was the whole celebration. What he never knew was how much of my drive came directly from him. Every early morning run, every night I stayed up past everyone else memorizing systems, I did with his voice in my head saying, "Let's see if you can hack it." I was not trying to spite him. I was trying to earn the seat next to him at the fence again, the one I'd quietly lost somewhere around the time Grant was born and the family found its real future pilot. I wanted my father to look at me the way he looked at the sky. I could hack it. I thrived there. For 4 years, I was exactly where I was supposed to be, on track for the one thing I had wanted my entire life. My instructors wrote things in my file I was not supposed to read and read anyway. Words like exceptional judgment and natural leader. I was near the top of my class. I had done everything right, everything that was supposed to add up to the cockpit, and for those 4 years, the math worked. And then, in my final year, during a flight physical I had taken a dozen times before, a doctor with a chart and a small machine found a depth perception finding that hadn't mattered until the standards tightened. He was kind about it, He was also final about it. In about 10 minutes, in a fluorescent room that smelled like rubbing alcohol, the cockpit I had organized my whole childhood around was taken off the table. I didn't fail out. I need you to understand the difference, because my family never did. I was commissioned a second lieutenant in 1998 at 22 years old into the operations and intelligence world. I would serve. I would just serve from a different seat than the one I dreamed about. A doctor took the cockpit away from me in a 10-minute appointment. My father heard, didn't make it. He never heard the rest. That summer, at a backyard gathering full of his old squadron friends, my father introduced me. I was standing there in a brand new uniform, prouder than I had ever been, and he put his hand on my shoulder and said, "This is Arnell. She's Air Force too, the office side. Somebody's got to push the paper." Everyone chuckled, the warm, easy chuckle of people who had all flown real airplanes. Grant, who was 10 then and already wanted to be exactly like our father, repeated it later that night like it was the funniest thing he'd ever heard. The office side. I remember standing a little apart from that party, holding a paper plate, watching the people I loved laugh about a version of me that wasn't real. And I made a decision, the kind of quiet decision that ends up shaping a whole life. I was not going to spend my career apologizing for a path I hadn't chosen. I was going to build something so undeniable that one day the room would go quiet for it on its own. I just had no idea, standing there at 22, how long that would take or where it would finally happen. What I gave my family for the next 20 years was loyalty. I came home for the holidays. I listened to the flying stories. I clapped for Grant at every milestone. I never once made them feel small for the way they made me feel small. And the whole time I was becoming someone they had decided in advance I could never be. In the early 2000s, something new arrived in the Air Force, and almost nobody wanted it. There was a strange, unglamorous aircraft that flew without a pilot in it, controlled from the ground, and at the time, most people in uniform thought it was a gimmick, a dead-end assignment, a career killer. The fast jet community looked down on it. Volunteering for it was, in the eyes of most ambitious officers, a way to disappear. I volunteered for it. I was a captain by then, 26 years old, and a friend pulled me aside when she heard what I'd put in for. "Nell," she said, "you do not want this. People go into that program and never get promoted again. They forget you exist." I told her I had a feeling about where the war was going. I had watched the early footage. I had seen what an aircraft could do when it could stay over a target, not for minutes but for hours, for half a day, patient and unblinking, while the people on the ground who depended on it slept or moved or fought. I understood, in a way most of my peers did not yet, that the future of air power was not always going to be a single man and a single jet screaming through for one pass. Sometimes it was going to be presence, endurance, the kind of patience that does not photograph well and does not make anyone famous. Everyone wanted the fast jets. I wanted the aircraft nobody believed in yet. I had spent my whole life being told I was on the wrong side of the cockpit. And here was a kind of flying where the cockpit was on the ground, where the thing that mattered was not your eyesight, but your judgment, your discipline, your ability to carry enormous weight for hours without breaking. It was as if someone had designed a war for the exact person a doctor's chart had told me I couldn't be. I will not pretend the family came around. The opposite happened. Once I was in the program, their dismissal got a name, and the name was funny to them. On a holiday visit when I was about 30, Grant, a teenager by then and burning to be a fighter pilot himself, said it to my face across the dinner table. "So let me get this straight. You fly a plane with a joystick, from a trailer, on the ground." He grinned. "That's a video game with a paycheck." The whole table laughed. My father laughed. And he did not correct him. That was the part that stayed with me. Not the joke, the silence after it. The cruelest part was that I could not defend myself, because almost everything I actually did was classified. I could not tell them what I flew, or where, or for whom, or what it cost me. So the silence, where the truth should have been, they filled with their own assumptions. I couldn't tell them what I did, so they decided it must not be much. And it was a great deal. I want to be careful here, because even now there is much I will never say. But picture a young captain in a low building in the desert, at 0300 hours, watching a screen that holds, in real and immediate terms, life and death. Picture the kind of decision that has to be made in seconds and lived with for years. Picture doing that through the night, then driving home in the gray dawn past a gas station and a fast food sign, and walking into an ordinary apartment carrying something no ordinary day could hold. That was the video game. That was the office side. I remember one night in particular, though I will keep the details where they belong, which is locked away. There was a small team of our people, pinned down somewhere they should not have been, in the dark, with the nearest help hours away. And for most of one long night, the only thing standing between them and the worst possible outcome was me and my crew, and the aircraft my family thought was a toy, holding station overhead, watching, waiting, ready. I did not eat. I did not look away from the screen. When the sun finally came up over that place, our people were still alive, and they would go home to their own families, and not one of them would ever know my name. I drove home that morning, and my hands were shaking on the wheel, and I stopped at a red light next to a man in a minivan, singing along to the radio, completely unaware that the world had nearly tipped over a few hours earlier, and a woman in the next lane had helped hold it up. I went into my apartment, and I sat on the floor, and I did not cry, because I had learned not to. Then I slept for 4 hours, and went back and did it again. There is a particular loneliness in carrying something that enormous, and having the people who love you most believe you carry nothing at all. By the time I was 33, in 2009, I had been promoted to major, which my friend had sworn would never happen to anyone in that program. I had flown hundreds of combat missions without ever leaving the ground. I had begun to write down, with a few others, how this new kind of warfare should actually be done, the procedures and the standards and the discipline that didn't exist yet because no one had needed them before. We were not playing a game. We were inventing the thing that would change modern war, and we were doing it while the rest of the force was still laughing. My family kept up their version of me anyway. At a cousin's wedding, an aunt asked my mother what I did now, and my mother said, "Oh, Nell does computer work for the Air Force. Very safe. We're glad she's not in any danger." I was standing close enough to hear it. I had, the week before, been part of something I still cannot describe. Something that had kept a column of our own people alive. Very safe. Computer work. I smiled and refilled my mother's wine and said nothing, because what was there to say that they would have believed? It was not only the big gatherings. It was 1,000 small moments stitched together over 20 years. It was the way my father, when someone asked about his children at a barbecue, would talk for 10 minutes about Grant's flight training and then add, almost as an afterthought, "And Nell's in the Air Force too, doing her thing." It was the birthday cards that said "proud of you," kiddo in the same handwriting that had once filled my logbook of memorized aircraft with corrections and praise. It was the Thanksgiving when an uncle, a kind man who meant no harm, asked if I'd ever thought about doing something with more of a future, and the whole table waited to see if I'd be sensible about it. I learned over those years a particular kind of smile. The smile you wear when you have decided that correcting someone will cost you more than letting them be wrong. I wore it so often it nearly became my face. And underneath it, quietly, I kept building the thing that would one day make the smile unnecessary. Here is the thing about being underestimated by the people who are supposed to know you best. After a while, you stop arguing, because arguing only makes you sound like you're begging for a grade. So I stopped. I let them have their small idea of me, and I poured everything I had into the work. Promotions came, slowly and then steadily. Lieutenant Colonel at 38 and a squadron of my own. Colonel at 43 and a group. Each time I called home, my father would ask if they'd given me a bigger office yet, and I would say yes, something like that, and let it go. I told myself the approval didn't matter. For a long time, that was a lie I needed. But somewhere in those years, it slowly stopped being a lie and started being almost true. Because the work itself had become enough. Every young aviator I trained, every crew that came home because of a standard I had helped write, every life on a screen that ended a different way because of a call I made, those were real in a way my father's nod could never be. I was building something too big to dismiss. I just hadn't yet stood in a place where the whole thing was visible at once. In 2025, at 49 years old, I pinned on my first star. Brigadier General. and with it came the assignment I had spent my entire career, without knowing it, getting ready for. I was given command of the combat remotely piloted aircraft enterprise. In plain language, the armed aircraft that fly in the actual fight, the ones the whole country now takes for granted, answer up a chain that ends at my desk. The little program no one wanted, the one that was going to make me disappear, had become the thing I now ran. Every reaper in the fight, mine to command. The change of command was set for the spring of 2026 at Creech Air Force Base out in the Nevada desert, the beating heart of the whole enterprise. I decided to fly out a day early, and I decided to do it quietly. No staff car, no escort, no announcement. My official badge for the base was still being processed and would be ready the next morning with the rest of the in-processing. I landed in civilian clothes, travel rumpled, with nothing on me to say who I was. I wanted, before I became the woman whose name would be on the building, to simply walk the flight line as a stranger and feel the truth of the place I was about to lead. It was late afternoon when I walked out toward the line. The desert light was going gold and long. There was a Reaper parked out there, that strange, beautiful aircraft I had given my life to, sitting quiet in the heat shimmer, and I just wanted 5 minutes alone with it before everything started. I wanted the truth of the place, not the polished version they'd show the general tomorrow. So I walked out toward it, an ordinary-looking woman of 50 in plain clothes, and that is when a young airman decided I did not belong. He was maybe 23, maybe 24. He came out of nowhere at a fast walk, the way you're trained to, putting his body between me and the aircraft, one hand up. Senior airman, by what I could see. He was doing exactly what he was supposed to do. He was just doing it louder than he needed to. "Get off my flight line, now," he said. "No badge, no business out here." His name tape said, Doyle. I stopped. I did not reach for anything, because I had nothing to reach for. I looked at this young man, all certainty and adrenaline, absolutely sure he had just caught someone where they shouldn't be, and I felt something close to tenderness, because I had been him once. 23, and sure I'd caught an intruder, ready to defend my aircraft against anyone. I knew exactly what was going through his head. "You don't get to stand there and stare at a Reaper, ma'am," he said when I didn't immediately retreat. My stillness, which was just patience, looked to him like guilt, and it made him sharper. "Lady, I will have you removed." "Then call your flight chief," I said. My voice was even. "That's the right call. Make it." I meant it as a kindness. I was telling him to do the thing that would protect both of us, the thing the rules existed for, but he heard it as a challenge. "I don't need to call anybody to walk a civilian off the line," he said. He took a half step closer, using his height, the way young men do when they have decided that volume and posture are the same thing as authority. "I've got people watching the cameras right now," he said. "You want to make this a thing? We can make it a thing. You can talk to the security forces in handcuffs if that's how you want your afternoon to go." I looked at him, and I did not feel insulted, which surprised me a little. I felt something almost like recognition. 20-some years earlier, I had stood on a flight line in a different desert, just as sure, just as ready to put my body between an aircraft and anyone who didn't belong. And if a stranger in plain clothes had wandered toward my predator, I'd have done exactly what this young man was doing. The instinct was good. The aggression was just inexperience. He hadn't yet learned that the people most likely to belong somewhere are often the ones who don't announce it. So I gave him a small nod, the kind you give someone whose mistake you understand, and I said again, evenly, "Call your flight chief, Airman. That's the procedure. Make the call." Maybe it was the calm, maybe it was the word, procedure, which is a word that only people who know the rules use. Something in it reached past his adrenaline because his hand went to his radio. Still, training won out over pride, because somewhere in him he knew the procedure. And he keyed his radio and called for his supervisor while keeping his eyes locked on me, as if I might bolt for the aircraft the second he looked away. I stood with my hands loose at my sides and waited. I had waited 50 years to be seen for what I was. I could wait another 2 minutes. Master Sergeant Eli Brandt came at a jog. I would learn his name in a moment, but right then he was just a flight chief in his 40s, moving fast toward what his airmen had called in, ready to back his troop, ready to remove a civilian from his flight line. He was already half-turned toward me with the firm, professional set of a man about to handle a problem. And then he got one clear look at my face. I watched the recognition hit the sergeant before he said a single word. I had been briefed to the wing leadership, my photograph circulated with the change of command package, and Master Sergeant Brandt was a man who knew exactly who was about to take command of everything he worked on. The color went out of his face. His jog turned into a stop so sudden he nearly stumbled. And Senior Airman Doyle, who had been watching me, now turned and watched his own flight chief, the man he had called over for backup, go pale and rigid in front of him. I saw the exact moment Doyle understood that something had gone very, very wrong. For a second, nobody moved. The desert wind moved the heat around us. Doyle looked at Brant, and Brant looked at me, and I just stood there, a stranger no longer, in the gold light of the place that was about to be mine. I have thought a great deal about that frozen second since, about how the whole shape of the next few minutes was already decided in it, and how it was decided not by anything I said, but by who I had quietly become over 28 years. The young airman did not yet know it, but the ground had already shifted under him. He had spent 90 seconds being absolutely certain, and certainty is a comfortable place to stand right up until the floor gives way. I knew that feeling too. I had stood on my own certainty about who my family thought I was, and watched it give way more than once. The only difference was that I'd had decades to get used to the falling, and he was about to do it all at once in front of everyone he worked with. Then Master Sergeant Brant found his voice, and he turned to his airman, and he said it low and fast and absolutely certain. "Airman, stand down. That's the general who runs every Reaper we fly." I watched it land on Doyle. I watched the word general go into him like cold water. His hand, still half raised toward me, dropped. His mouth opened and nothing came out. He looked back at me, and you could see him frantically rewinding the last 90 seconds, every word he'd said. "Lady, get off my flight line. I will have you removed." All of it now playing back against the word general. That was when Chief Master Sergeant Yvonne Pratt arrived. The wing's senior enlisted leader, the command chief, a woman in her late 40s with 28 years of presence in her shoulders. She took in the scene in one practiced sweep, my face, Brant's color, Doyle's frozen stance, and she did the thing that senior enlisted leaders do, which is take command of a moment without saying very much at all. "Flight! Attention!" she called, and every troop on that section of the line came to attention with a single crack of boots. Then she turned to me, and her voice changed completely, formal and warm at once. "General Maddox, ma'am, we did not have you until tomorrow." "I came early, Chief," I said. "My fault entirely. There was no badge and no warning. Your airman did exactly what I'd want him to do." But Doyle was not all right. He was standing at a rigid attention, staring straight ahead, and when he tried to speak, his voice came apart. "Ma'am, I didn't. There was no badge. He stopped, swallowed, tried again, and failed. I have rarely seen a young person so completely undone. He had been so sure. That was the thing. He had been so sure he was right, and being right had made him loud, and now the certainty had been pulled out from under him in front of everyone he worked with. I stepped closer to him, and I made my voice quiet, just for him, not for the flight. "Look at me, Airman." He did, barely. "You did your job," I said. "You saw someone near a multi-million-dollar combat aircraft with no badge and no business being there, and you moved to protect it. That is exactly what you were supposed to do. The only thing you got wrong," I said, "was thinking I wasn't one of yours." I watched that sentence work on him, and I chose it carefully, because I remembered with perfect clarity what it felt like to be told the opposite. To be looked at by people who were supposed to be on your side and treated like you were not really one of them. I was not going to do that to this kid, not even now, not even with every right to. He had made an honest mistake out of an honest instinct, and the worst thing I could do for a young troop with good instincts was teach him that good instincts get you destroyed. So I held his eyes until I was sure he understood that I was not angry, that I was, in some strange way, that he could not yet follow, almost grateful. Behind us, a staff car had pulled up, and Colonel Brian Toth was climbing out of it fast. He was the commander of the wing here at Creech, a solid officer in his late 40s, and he had clearly just been told by radio that the incoming general was standing on his flight line, being yelled at by one of his airmen. He was, understandably, mortified. He came up with the rigid energy of a man whose worst afternoon was unfolding in real time. "General, I am so sorry. I'll have him off the line tonight. This is unacceptable." "You'll do no such thing, Colonel," I said, and I said it firmly enough that he stopped mid-stride. He stays exactly where he is. That young man protected an aircraft from a person he could not identify. If I relieve him for that, I teach this entire flight line that the right thing to do is look the other way when they're unsure. I will not start my command by punishing a troop for having the spine to challenge me. Colonel Toth blinked, then nodded slowly, and I saw something shift in how he looked at me, which I would only understand later. He had expected the new general to want a head on a plate. Instead, she had protected his airmen. That mattered to him. I told the chief I'd find my own way to quarters, and I walked off that flight line into the gathering dusk. But I did not sleep much that night. I sat in the bare, temporary quarters they'd given me, and I turned the afternoon over and over, and what kept surfacing was not the airman's face. It was my father's. Because the boy on the flight line and the men at my father's table had made the exact same mistake. They had looked at me and decided, before I said a word, what I could not possibly be. The difference was that the airman had an excuse. He was 23, I was in civilian clothes, and there genuinely was no badge. He'd had 90 seconds and no information. My father had 50 years and all the information in the world, and he had still gotten it wrong. That was the thought that kept me up. Not anger, exactly. Something quieter and older than anger. I lay in that narrow bed, and I let myself feel, for once, the full size of it. The decades of small remarks, the office side, the computer work, the very safe, the video game with a paycheck, the way my own mother had described my life to relatives in words designed to make it disappear. I had spent so many years refusing to feel it, because feeling it had always seemed like the first step toward begging, and I had promised myself at 22 that I would never beg. But there is a difference between begging and grieving, and I had never let myself do the second one. So I did it that night, alone, in a room that smelled like industrial carpet and air conditioning. 50 years old with a star on the uniform hanging in the closet. I grieved the father I'd had at the fence line, the one who answered my questions, the one I'd lost so slowly I never got to say goodbye to him. The hardest people to convince, I realized that night, had always shared my last name. And for the first time in my life, sitting alone in that little room, I let myself wonder what would happen if I stopped trying to convince them, and simply let them see. The next morning I did something I had been avoiding for a long time. I started making decisions, not just about the wing, but about my family and about the young man on the flight line and about the kind of leader and the kind of daughter I was finally going to be. First, the airman. I had Master Sergeant Brandt bring Senior Airman Doyle to me before the duty day really began. The young man came in braced for the worst, certain, I think, that the speech about second chances was just the part that came before the discipline. I did not give him discipline, I gave him a question. "Do you know what these aircraft actually do?" I asked him, "and who actually flies them?" He admitted that he did not really. He guarded them. He had never been told the rest. So I told him I wanted him to learn. "You protect these airframes every day," I said. "I want you to understand the mission you're protecting and the people who fly it. And I want you at the change of command ceremony. Stand in the formation, watch the whole thing." He looked at me like I'd handed him something he didn't know how to hold. I think he had walked in expecting to be made small, and instead I had handed him a reason to grow. Master Sergeant Brandt, standing behind him, gave me a look over the young man's shoulder that I will remember for the rest of my command. A look that said, "I will follow you anywhere." You do not earn that look by punishing people. You earn it by protecting them when you have every right not to. It is the only kind of authority that actually holds when things get hard. And you cannot fake it, and you cannot order it. And most people who reach for stars never learn that it exists. Then I made the harder call. I picked up the phone and I called my father. I want to tell you how that call usually went so you understand what I did differently. Normally I would brace for the small remark, the question about whether they'd given me a window office yet, and I would shrink the truth down to something that wouldn't provoke him, something modest and safe, and I would get off the phone before the ache could set in. I had been managing my own father's contempt for so long that I did it automatically, the way you favor an old injury without noticing. This time, when he asked, "Change of command, huh? They given you an office with a window now." I did not shrink it. I also did not argue it. I simply said, "Something like that, Dad. Just come. Bring Mom, bring Grant. Be there." And I left it at that. I did not explain. I did not defend. For the first time in my adult life, I decided to let the truth arrive in person, in a room I controlled, instead of trying to make him believe it over a phone line where he had spent 5 decades not listening. He grumbled that it was a long way to fly for a paperwork ceremony. There was a time that grumble would have made me launch into the explanation, the defense, the careful laying out of what the ceremony actually meant, all of it pitched in the slightly pleading tone of a child still trying to be picked for the fence line. I heard the old reflex rise up in me, the urge to say, "Dad, it is not paperwork. It is the most important day of my career. Please understand." And I let the reflex pass without acting on it. I had spent 50 years trying to make him understand in advance, with words, over the phone, and it had never once worked. Words were not going to do it. Only the thing itself would do it. So I just said, "It's a long way. I know. I'd still like you there." And I let the silence sit, and I did not fill it with my own smallness. My brother Grant, when I called him, was worse, in the offhand way that had stopped surprising me. "Yeah, I'll come," he said. "I've got real flying that week, but I'll move some things around." Real flying, the phrase a major fighter pilot uses without even hearing himself say it, to the sister who has commanded combat aircraft since before he earned his wings. I just said, "Thank you, Grant. It would mean a lot." And I hung up, and I did not let it ruin my day, which was itself a kind of victory. What I had decided in the bare quiet of that first night was this. I was done defending myself in advance. I was done shrinking. The ceremony itself would say what I had never been able to make them hear. They could believe it or not, but they would be in the room when the truth was read out loud, and I would not be standing there begging for the grade. I would just be standing there, finally, as who I was. The days before the ceremony, I stepped fully into the command. And I want to tell you what I actually saw, because it is the answer to every joke ever made at that dinner table. I walked the operations floor. I stood behind the ground control stations and watched air crews fly combat missions in real time, half a world away, with a focus so total it was like watching surgeons. The office side. Rooms full of young aviators carrying the weight of the war on their shoulders for 13 hours at a stretch, making decisions most people will never have to make in their entire lives. And then driving home past a fast food drive-thru to a quiet apartment, alone with what they'd seen. There is nothing soft about it. There is nothing safe about it. It is one of the hardest things our military asks of anyone, and it is done in silence, without parades, by people the rest of the world pictures playing a game. I stood behind one crew for a while, a pilot and a sensor operator, neither of them past 26, and I watched them work a long mission with a focus that would have humbled anyone who'd ever made the video game joke. There is a particular weight to what they do that the fast jet world, for all its real courage, does not carry in quite the same way. A fighter pilot is there and gone, the engagement measured in seconds, the adrenaline burning clean. My crews live with the target for hours. They learn its patterns, they see the small human details, the things you cannot unsee, and then they carry the decision home, and there is no debrief that takes it back out of you. The men in my family had spent their lives believing that distance from the cockpit meant distance from the cost. They had it exactly backward. The screen does not protect you from the weight. The screen makes you stare at it, unblinking, for 13 hours, and then drive home and pretend at dinner that your day was ordinary. I found Technical Sergeant Dana Cole on that floor, a sensor operator I had mentored years before when she was brand new and terrified and gifted. She had grown into one of the best in the force. I asked her quietly to take Senior Airman Doyle under her wing for a day, to walk him through what really happened on the missions he guarded. I watched part of it from across the room. I watched Doyle's face as Sergeant Cole walked him through a mission profile, and I saw the exact thing I'd hoped to see. The moment a young person realizes the thing they'd been guarding without understanding is far larger and far heavier than they ever knew. At one point, Cole said something to him, nodding toward me across the room, and I read it on her lips. "The general flew this airframe before you were in high school. She wrote half of how we do this." Doyle looked at me then, and the look was completely different from the one he'd given me on the flight line. It was the look you give something when you finally understand its size. I had seen that look exactly once on my father's face. When I was small and we stood at the fence and a jet broke into the break overhead, and I gasped and he glanced down and saw me understanding for the first time what he loved. I had spent a lifetime chasing that look from him and never getting it back. And here it was, freely, on the face of a stranger's kid, who 3 days earlier had threatened to put me in handcuffs. Funny, the place's respect comes from once you stop demanding it from the one place that withheld it. Sergeant Cole found me afterward and told me quietly that Doyle had stayed an extra hour just asking questions, that he'd wanted to understand the whole chain, from the maintainer who turned the wrench to the crew who flew the mission to the desk where the orders came down. "He's a good one, ma'am," she said. "He just needed somebody to show him the bigger thing instead of yelling at him for not already seeing it." I told her that was the truest description of leadership I'd heard in a long time, and that I'd spent 50 years being on the wrong end of the alternative. Not everyone wanted me to be gentle. One of my new staff officers, a sharp, ambitious type, suggested that the flight line incident, and frankly my family's long history of underestimating me, were exactly the kind of thing I should leverage, that a new commander could use a story like that to put people in their place. I told him no. I am not going to spend the respect I earned, I said, punishing people for not seeing it sooner. Because here's what I had finally understood in my 50th year. The contempt I'd lived under had two possible endings. I could become bitter and hand it down, become the kind of commander, the kind of person who makes others feel small to feel tall. Or I could refuse to pass it on. I chose to refuse. The world had enough people looking at someone and deciding what they couldn't be. I was not going to add to them. And somewhere in those days, the strangest thing happened. The need loosened. For 50 years I had carried underneath everything a small, constant hunger for my father to finally see me, to take it back, to say he'd been wrong. And standing on that operations floor, watching my people do the impossible through the night, I realized I no longer needed his signature on my worth. I knew what I had built. I could see it with my own eyes, all around me, every screen and every crew and every life that had gone a different way because of work he would never know about. It was enough. It was finally, completely enough. Which is, I think, the exact moment a thing like this stops controlling you. Not when you get the apology, when you stop needing it. My family flew in the day before the ceremony, and the correcting began before I ever said a word, because the base itself started telling them the truth. I met them at the gate, and I watched my father take in the security, the seriousness, the armed posture of a place that runs an actual war. He frowned. "Why is everyone so squared away?" he said, "about a paperwork ceremony." I just smiled and said, "Come on, I'll show you where you're sitting." My mother was quieter than I'd ever seen her. She kept glancing at me sideways, the way you look at a familiar room when someone has rearranged the furniture and you can't quite say what's different. At one point, while my father was distracted by a passing formation, she touched my arm and said, very low, "Nell, what exactly do you do out here?" 50 years a fighter pilot's wife, and 30 of them my mother, and she was asking me the question for the first time, as if she actually wanted the real answer, instead of the small, safe one she'd always supplied for me. I looked at her, and I felt no triumph, only a kind of soft sadness for all the years she'd spent translating me into something harmless. "You'll hear it in a few hours, Mom," I said. "I promise it'll be clearer than anything I could say standing here." She nodded slowly and did not let go of my arm for a while. Walking in, it got harder for them to hold their old idea of me. Officers greeted me with deference. Senior enlisted called me ma'am in the way that is not just manners, but means something. A full colonel, Brian Toth, stopped to brief me on a detail and addressed me with complete respect, and I saw my brother Grant watch the entire exchange with his mouth slightly open. When Toth moved off, Grant leaned in close. "Nell," he said low. "That was a full-bird colonel calling you ma'am like it mattered." There was something in his voice I had never heard before, directed at me. Uncertainty. "It does matter, Grant," I said. "Sit down. Watch." And then the thing I could not have planned happened on its own. Senior Airman Doyle, there in his dress uniform at my invitation, came over to where my family stood, not knowing who they were. He just saw an older couple, and a major looking a little lost, and he did what good airmen do, he stepped up to help. And in helping, he told them, with the open earnestness of a young man who has found someone to admire, the story of the flight line. "I actually ordered her off the line, sir," he said to my father, not knowing he was speaking to her father. 3 days ago. Didn't know who she was. No badge, civilian clothes, and I got right up in her face about it." He shook his head at himself. "And you know what she did when she could have ended my career? She kept me on the job, said I did the right thing protecting the aircraft. That's the kind of commander she is. We'd all follow her anywhere." I was a few feet away, close enough to see my father's face, while a complete stranger described his daughter as a leader worth following. I watched Raymond Maddox, who had spent 50 years with the dismissive remark always loaded and ready, find that he had nothing to say. The young airman drifted off to his place in the formation, having no idea what he'd just done. And my father stood very still in that hangar, looking at me like he was meeting someone new. I want to be honest about how that felt, because it was not the clean victory I might have imagined as a younger woman. It was complicated. Part of me wanted to say, "See? A stranger figured out in 3 days what you couldn't see in 50 years. But the larger part of me just felt tired and tender and oddly protective of the old man standing there with his certainties collapsing. Because here's the thing nobody tells you about finally being seen by the person who refused to see you. By the time it comes, you have usually already done the hard work of not needing it. Which means the moment lands softer than you expected, more like weather than like fireworks." My father looked at me like he was meeting someone new, and the truth, the sad and freeing truth, was that he was. He had never actually met the woman I'd become. He'd been too busy mourning the daughter he thought he'd lost to a flight physical to notice the one standing right in front of him, running a war. The ceremony was held with the wing in formation, ranks of airmen standing at attention in the desert morning, the aircraft lined up behind them. 3 days earlier, a young airman had ordered me off that flight line. Now the whole wing stood on it, waiting for me to take command of it. I took the review walking the line, and somewhere in those ranks, standing tall, was Senior Airman Doyle. The same flight line, a different woman standing on it, in the eyes of everyone watching, maybe even in my own. I walked that line slowly, past rank after rank of the people I now commanded, and I let myself feel the full circle of it. 28 years earlier, I had been commissioned into a career everyone in my family had treated as a consolation prize. I had volunteered for the one program that was supposed to bury me. I had spent 2 decades being laughed at across dinner tables for flying aircraft that have since reshaped the way the entire world thinks about war. And now I was walking the flight line of the beating heart of all of it. Every face turned toward me, every spine straight, the desert sun coming up over the aircraft like it had come up over that long-ago night when I helped hold the world in place and drove home with shaking hands. Nobody at that dinner table had been there for any of it. But they were here now, and the place itself, the formation, the aircraft, the silence, was about to tell them everything I had never been able to. Then came the part I had been quietly waiting 50 years for, though I had not let myself admit it. The presiding officer, a senior general, read the orders aloud. He read my name, my rank, and then he read, in the plain, unembellished language of an official order, the scope of what I was assuming command of. He described the combat aircraft, the global reach, the responsibility. "Brigadier General Eleanor Maddox," he said, "assumes command of every combat sortie this enterprise flies." Every combat sortie. Read out loud, in front of God and the desert and my family, in words no one could shrink or laugh off or call computer work. I did not look for their faces. I had spent 50 years training myself not to need them, and I was not going to undo that in the most important professional moment of my life. I kept my eyes forward and my bearing correct. But I am human, and I felt the silence behind me change. I felt my mother's small sound, a hand going to her mouth. I felt my brother sit forward in his seat, and I felt, more than saw, my father go completely and utterly still. The stillness of a man watching a lifetime of his own certainty quietly come apart. The video game with a paycheck, the office side, the girl who didn't make it, all of it dying in real time in the sun while a general read the truth into a microphone. There is a strange mercy in letting a moment like that happen without looking. I had imagined in younger and angrier years that if this day ever came, I would want to watch their faces, that I would want to collect the shock like a debt being repaid. But standing there in the formation with my eyes forward, I understood that watching would have made it about them, and it had never really been about them. It was about a promise I'd made to a girl holding a paper plate at a backyard party, the promise that one day the room would go quiet for her on its own. The room had gone quiet. I did not need to turn around and confirm it on their faces. I could hear it. The quiet was the whole point. The quiet was the answer to every joke. And I stood inside it at the center of a silent parade field, and I kept my bearing, and I let the truth do the work I had spent 50 years trying and failing to do with words. The ceremony ended, the formation was released, and the only conversation that still had to happen the one 50 years in the making, was finally in front of me, with the desert wind moving across a field full of the aircraft I now commanded. My father came to me first. He came across that field slowly, and he had nothing in his hands and nothing on his face except something I had honestly never seen there before, which was humility. The script he'd used my whole life was gone. For a moment, he just looked at me, this old fighter pilot, and then he said, in a voice that was not steady, "I spent 50 years thinking you didn't make it." He stopped. He looked at the aircraft, at the formation breaking up, at the colonels who deferred to me, and back at his daughter. I was the one who didn't see it. I had imagined this moment in weaker years as a moment of triumph. I had imagined feeling vindicated, maybe even imagined wanting him to hurt the way I had. But standing there, I felt none of that. I felt only a kind of clean quiet. "You see it now," I told him. "That's enough." And I meant it all the way down. It was enough. Not because he had finally validated me, but because I no longer needed him to. The seeing was a gift I could receive freely now, precisely because I was no longer starving for it. He stood there a moment longer, and then he said the thing I think he had actually flown all that way to say, the thing underneath the apology. "I lost you," he said, "somewhere a long time ago. I had a daughter who stood at that fence with me, and then one day a doctor said you couldn't fly, and I grieved it like it was the end of something, and I think I grieved you right along with it. I am sorry, Nell. I mourned a girl who was standing right in front of me the whole time, doing more than I ever did." It was the longest and truest thing my father had ever said to me. I reached out and took his hand, the same hand that used to point at jets over the fence line, older now and not quite steady, and I held it. We did not say anything else. We didn't need to. 50 years, and it came down to two people holding hands on a flight line, watching the sun finish coming up. Grant came next. My little brother, the fighter pilot, the one who had made the joke that lived in me for 20 years. He stood in front of me, and for once in his life, he didn't have anything clever queued up. He looked at the star on my shoulder and at the aircraft, and then he did something that surprised us both. He came to attention and rendered a salute. Crisp and correct, the salute, a major, owes a general, except that it was also a brother apologizing to his sister in the only language our family had ever really spoken. "Permission to stop being an idiot about your job, General," he said, and his voice cracked on the last word. I returned the salute, and then I broke every bit of military bearing and hugged him. He held on a beat longer than I expected, and into my shoulder he said, quietly, so only I could hear, "I used to tell people you flew a desk. I knew it wasn't fair when I said it. I think I needed you to be smaller so I could feel bigger." It was the most honest thing my brother had ever said to me, and it cost him something, and I loved him for it. "You were a kid copying Dad," I told him. "And then you grew up and you're a good pilot and a better man than that joke. We're square, Grant. We've been square." He pulled back and wiped his face like there was something in his eye, the way men in my family have always handled the moments that matter most, and I let him keep the dignity of pretending it was the desert wind. I found Senior Airman Doyle in the thinning crowd before he could slip away, the young man who had, without meaning to, given me the most honest moment of the whole affair. He went rigid when he saw me coming, still a little afraid, I think, that the bill would eventually come due. It never would. "Airman Doyle," I said, "I want to tell you something, and I want you to actually hear it." He waited. 3 days ago, you saw a stranger near one of my aircraft, and you put yourself between that stranger and that airframe without knowing or caring who she was or how it might go for you. You guarded my aircraft from me. I let that sit. That is exactly who I want on my flight line. Don't you ever lose that. Whatever he had been bracing for, it wasn't that. He stood a little taller for the rest of the day. I'd been there. I knew what that felt like. I learned later that Doyle put in for retraining a few months after, asking to cross over into the mission side, to become one of the people who actually fly the aircraft he had spent his early career guarding. Sergeant Cole told me about it with obvious pride, like she'd recruited him herself, which in a way she had. I signed off on it the moment it reached me. There is a particular satisfaction in watching someone choose to grow toward the thing they once stood outside of, and an even sharper one in being the person who holds the door instead of slamming it. My father had slammed a door on me gently without ever meaning to. I got to open one for a kid who threatened to put me in handcuffs. That trade felt like the right shape of a life to me. That evening, I walked back out onto the flight line alone, the way I had 3 days before, except that now the badge was on my chest, and the place was mine, and there was no one to order me off it. The light was going gold, and long again. The Reaper sat out there in the cooling air, that strange, beautiful aircraft no one had wanted, the one that was supposed to make me disappear and instead had become the thing I commanded. My family was somewhere behind me, finally seeing me. And the war I actually run was out there in front of me, in the dark, being carried by young people, the world pictures playing a game. I want to leave you with the thing I learned, because I think some of you need to hear it tonight. The best moment of my career was not the star on my shoulder, and it was not even my father finally saying he'd been wrong. The best moment was earlier, alone in a bare room, when I realized I had stopped needing anyone to hand me my worth. If you have ever been measured by people who never saw what you carried, by family, by a stranger, by anyone who looked at you and decided in advance what you couldn't be, then hear me, because I lived it for 50 years. You do not have to prove it to them. You do not have to get loud or get even, or shrink yourself to keep their peace. You just have to keep building, quietly and relentlessly, until the truth of you is simply too big to deny. And then when the room finally goes quiet for you, you'll find you don't need the applause at all. You'll already know that, I promise you, is the only revenge worth having. If you've ever spent years being measured by people who never once saw what you actually carried, I would love to hear about it in the comments. Did someone in your own family decide who you were and then refuse to ever update it? Was there a moment when the truth finally arrived and spoke louder than anything you could have said yourself? And if you had been me on that flight line, could you have kept that young airman on the job, or would your pride have made a different call? Tell me. I read them. If this story meant something to you, hit subscribe and stay a while.